Assalamu alaikum. This is basically lecture one, Institutional Economics PhD course. After every lecture, I will give you some recording, particularly, but it will again be dependent upon the time I have. But still, I will put some effort to give you the recording of every lecture so that you can always recall the major concepts by looking at or sorry, by listening and looking at the video. So today we actually discussed 10 slides of why nation fail, the origin of power, prosperity, and poverty. This book is basically written by James A. Robinson with his colleague Daron Acemoglu. Both of them are Nobel Prize winner in economics on the topic of institutional economics. I'm not using my own slides, rather I'm taking the slides of James A. Robinson himself, which he has taught in Harvard University. So before actually I talk about this very important graph, let's discuss that what this actually book is all about, and also that what we are going to study in this book. Before we understand that, I need to put a very basic question to you, and that question is, why are some nations rich and other poor? I'm sure that this is a question that every economist student might have encountered somewhere in his life, because someone might have asked you that why is that some countries are rich and why is it that some countries are really poor. And this question has disturbed not only economists but also historians and policymakers, and this is not a phenomenon of just today, but it has been carried out from centuries. So when we look around the world, we actually see that there are huge income inequalities. Some countries enjoy high incomes, they have strong educational system, they have advanced technology, they're more politically stable. While other countries, if you see, they have, a very depressing story. They have high poverty, high unemployment, corruption, weak governance, and this is basically not a story of a day, but these crises are repeated in nature. So before reading this book, I think there are some ready-made answers which are already in your brain. Remember the process of learning in PhD. Step one of learning in PhD is to relearn what you have already, studied. Because from here you're going to start thinking in a very critical way, in a very different way. So till MPhil level or master's level, it was actually learning, learning, and learning. But at PhD level, you unlearn to relearn or to learn new. Okay, so I'm sure that you might have these ready-made answers to the question that I have put. Some of you think that Western countries are rich because they're very hardworking. Some of you might say that poor countries are corrupt by culture, and this is one of the reason why they are poor. Some of you might have answers like Africa is poor because of its climate, as we discussed in class. Some of you have discussed that South Asia, particularly, the southern parts of Asia, is underdeveloped because of religion, or there is very high population rate. Now, in this book, Acemoglu and Robinson say that all these explanations are very misleading. So they argue very clearly that nations fail not because of geography, culture, or ignorance, but because of some other thing. What is that some other thing? I'm going to discuss in further slides. So I'm not, taking away the suspense from you. There is something more than geography, culture, and ignorance that is the root cause of why some countries are poor and why some are rich. But before that, you need to understand that what is institutions, or what are institutions. Institutions, as I taught in the class, is basically the rules or the rule of the game in a country which would determine whether it will become rich or poor. That are institutions. So institutions are not organizations, as I taught in the class. Institutions are not buildings. Institutions are basically formal norms, informal norms that embodies incentives and disincentives, which through their enforcement mechanism can shape human behavior. So institutions are laws, institutions are political systems, institutions are, you can say, the economic rules, they are the property rights, they are the power structures, or they are basically the decision making process, the enforcement mechanism which make them institutions. So there are some, questions which you can say all of these questions you can ask, which are basically institutional questions. For example, who owns the land? Who has the property rights? Who can start a business? Are there monopolies? Are there some entry to barriers? Who gets the education? Is it for poor? Really? Do we have such kind of policies? Who will pay the taxes? How will they pay the taxes? What is going to be the mechanism? Will it be just? Who controls the police, courts, and army? Now, these are some important questions that we ask while we are studying institutional economics. And these are very important questions because institutions would determine that who gets the opportunity. It will determine that who are the people who will get excluded or who benefits from growth or who would control the political part. So Pakistan, if you take the example of Pakistan, which is very important, so Pakistan is a perfect case study. We have very good land, we have natural resources, our geography is really good for us to grow. Um, then we have a large number of youth population. We have strong diaspora, yet we have some structural issues, yet we are not able to grow. We have low text-based collection, as we saw in today's Pasha Saab's video. Um, our most of the incomes are elite captured. Our political system is elite captured. We have weak rule of law. We suffer from political instability. We have always suffered on the index of poor human development. Why? To know this, you need to study this book and you need to take this course of institutional economics. Because according to this course and according to this book, if we are going to try to find out the reasons of why Pakistan is not able to become one of the richest country or why one of the many richest country, we can find some answers. And according to this book, Why Nations Fail, the answer is not religion or culture. Rather, it is the institutions. Institutions that have benefit for a few at the cost of many. This is very important and I like to repeat it for you. Institutions that benefit a few at the cost of many are a type of extractive institutions. So this is important and this is what I want to make over here, make point over here that poverty is not a moral failure. It is an institutional outcome. Okay, so over here, the lay of land, basically, this is a very interesting and a very important graph, and it actually shows GDP per capita from 1000 AD to 2000, and there are different, regions that are shown in this graph. Not so clear, but it is actually showing Western Europe, Western offshores. When we talk about Western offshores, we are talking about USA, Canada, or Australia. The countries of Latin America. Then we have Asia over here, and we have African region as well. So basically, this graph is very important because it shows that what are the reasons or why the divergence has occurred. Not really why, but the patterns of divergence. Over here, do you see before, in 1000, which is the richest region, this orange line? This is basically Africa. And this is the time when Africa was not backward. And over here, if you see, the second is, um, okay, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. This basically line is for Asia. So Asia is having a highest, GDP per capita, and then followed by the other regions including African and all, and almost they are at the similar level, but still Asia is ahead of them. So Asia basically was not poor, and Europe on the other hand was not rich, and Africa was not backwards. This is the story of this graph. And this also destroys the myth that we believe that the West was always superior. No, it was never the case, really. So, why does this divergence start? Something has happened in 1500, which is why this divergence has occurred. And in 1500, basically, the reason why Western Europe is, cutting off this Asia and becoming, ahead of Asia is basically colonial expansion. Later on, if you see, this is a very important point, 1700s. And here, if I'm going to tell you one reason or one word answer that what has happened over here is basically it's the institutional change in Europe. And in 1800, not so far from the 1700s, in 1800s is the Industrial Revolution. So why is this, very important? Because, in this 17 and 1800s, there is a very sharp increase in GDP per capita as compared to what was being carried out before. Institutions and Industrial Revolution. So poverty is not historically created, and rather poverty is not natural. This is what, this lay of land shows. In South Asia, if you say, in the 18th century in particular, India and China, contributed over 50% of the world's GDP. Isn't it interesting? 15% of the world's GDP is coming just from India and China. And Mughal India in those times had, advanced textiles, trade, and agriculture. But what happened today is that South Asia struggles with poverty and underdevelopment. What actually changed? What changed that Western Europe had a very high upshoot as compared to Africa or Asia, and that is institutions. So uh, this is important for us to understand that if you take another example, you can say that British colonial rule did not aim to educate masses, industrialize colonies, and build inclusive markets. Instead, in these times, what changes was that to extract the revenue, to maintain order, and to pollute, uh, you can say, and to protect the elite collaborators. So these institutions are very important, and this is the reason why uh, you can see that changes has occurred over the history. So let's move to next slide. Okay, now over here there is Spanish, and in Spanish they are trying to say is that Spanish colonization of Latin America was basically extractive in nature from day one. And Spanish people were the ones, in very simple words, I'm trying to explain. They wanted to have gold, silver, and they were having forced labor. And in the regions such as, Mexico and Peru. So basically, this word over here is basically not so familiar to you because it's not, understandable. But they're actually talking about two regions, Mexico and Peru, and they found out that they were, the regions where they had very dense population and there were existing hierarchies. So they took over the ruling structure and they have, forced natives to work, and this created systems like Mita. So basically, it is trying to say that the meaning of extractive institutions is that wealth flows upward, which means that whatever the wealth is, it is for the elite class, for the toppers, for the rulers, for the ones who control the system. So power is basically concentrated, and not only power is concentrated, but innovations are discouraged and education is restricted, as we discussed in class. That then when there is corruption, and when there is no merit, and when there is no system, and when when the state is weak, then obviously the only tool they can do is that to keep their masses uneducated. So it has some long term effects. So even today we see that these regions are poorer. Yeah, I'm talking about Mexico, and it is the same story of what was the name of the president of uh, no, we discussed Carlos Slim's story in the class. Yes, from uh, from the book of Why Nations Fail. So even today, we find that these regions are poorer. They have less infrastructure, they have less education, and there are more inequalities in this. So I want you to reflect it in the case of Pakistan as well, because this book is not dealing, with the story of Pakistan, but it tells the story of Pakistan inherently. Uh, in the British has introduced the Zimedari uh, system, the agricultural system, the canal colonies, the revenue extractions in this, subcontinental region. And what was their purpose? Their purpose was to control and extract, not develop. So feudal families today are direct institutional descendants of the colonial arrangements that were done in the past. So although they have left, but it is in our now informal norms that we have been, the carrier of direct institutional descendants of colonial arrangements. So this is what this slide is telling you about. Now this is another very interesting slide, and this I would like to read. No man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon the pain of death. Anyone who robs a garden, public or private, or a vineyard, or who steals an of corn shall be punished with death. Death. No member of the colony will sell or give any commodity of this country to a captain, mariner, master, or a sailor to transport out of the colony for his private use, upon the pain of death. What does it show? It shows the beginning of United States, a story of failed extraction. British tried same system in Jamestown as well. So basically these are the colonization attempts of Virginia Company in Jamestown in the early 17th centuries, and they are attempting to recreate an authoritarian or extractive regime. So they are imposing forced labor, death penalties, and very strict controls. But despite of that, it and this is the crux of the story. But the company was unsuccessful. It could not force the English settlers into the gang labor and low wages. So why? Why did this happen? Upon the pain of death in everything, you just, you rope a corn shell and you are facing the pain of death. But still you are unable to make this company successful. It has failed. Why? Because labor scarcity was a problem. There was no dense population, and settlers were restricted. Not only restricted, but they also resisted. So, the important thing that comes from the story is that institutions cannot survive without the social support or the economic incentives. Let's take the example of Pakistan. Authoritarian control fail when middle class grows, when education expands, when media increases awareness. Pakistan before the independence of media was a different story. Pakistan, in my childhood, when there was only PTV, a PTV World, and there was one more channel, I forgot the name right now. There were only two to three channels, right? Media was not independent, and now we have so many channels, Geo and um, Capital TV, ARY. There's so many channels I can even think of, and these channels are basically creating awareness. So institutions have evolved over the time, and story has also become a different. Okay, moving forward, the beginning. So basically, the British has introduced the head right system, okay, which actually talked about the land ownership and the political participation. And this created incentives and investment and also, innovations. The critical idea basically is that economic inclusion came before the democracy. And this is one of the reasons why United States could grow. Uh, Now I want you to again reflect back after the case of Pakistan because in Pakistan, are there really land reforms? Do people have business success? And do we have education equity? Okay, so democracy has remained weak since 1947 with due apologies. This is one of the reasons why Pakistan is not among the richest countries, as per the theory of why nations fail. Okay, so this basically, I have not discussed it in class, but this basically shows the colonial legacy today, and it shows that the forced labor system has created persistent poverty. So you see persistent poverty over here, and institutions basically are for very and institutions have played a very important role in making these areas poor or in explaining why they are still poor. Okay, this slide, slide 7, is basically about the making sense of divergence, and it is trying to tell you the story that the same culture may have different outcomes and same geography have may have different outcomes. And there is something that explains this whole context. But before that, let me reflect back on whatever we have studied till now. We have still studied that there is something that is the prime engine of growth, and that is institutions. We have also somehow discussed a little bit about the extractive and the inclusive institutions. And from now on, we are actually trying to understand that what are basically extractive economic, extractive political, and so on, different types of institutions. Okay, so this is very important. At this point, the class, I basically asked everyone to stop and read this and understand this. That if geography, culture, religion, and ignorance are not the main reason for poverty, then what exactly went wrong? And this slide is basically the intellectual turning point of the entire book, I would say. Because everything before this slide prepares the ground, and everything after this slide will build on the grounds that have been prepared. So that is why I took a break to reflect back that whatever we have discussed so far. Now, the authors, the Nobel Prize holders, are doing something very bold here. They are systematically rejecting the most popular explanations for the global inequality in the history. So let us, take them one by one, very slowly, carefully, and critically. They're trying to say that religion is not the reason why, some countries are rich and some are poor. They say that attitudes are not the reason why some are poor or rich, and also the values are not the reason. Similarly, the geography, climate, topography, these are not the reasons. Okay, let me do that a little bit more for your clarity, because there's a huge amount of literature which says that which explains that the geography is why some countries have developed and some are rich, and some are poor. So this theory basically of the geography hypothesis, if I may call, and if I try to explain why it fails, is that the geography hypothesis says that the tropical countries are poor and the temperate countries are rich. And this is because disease, heat, soil, floods, and climate basically determine the development. And although this sounds very logical, and many famous economists have supported their view, but in this book, Acemoglu and Robinson says that geography may influence these outcomes, but it does not basically determine the destiny. Okay, so if you're going to say that, okay, fine, you are saying it, ma'am, but what is the reason? What is the evidence that goes against this geography? Story of North Korea and South Korea. They have the same geography, they have the same culture, they have the same history, but they're very different from each other. Rather, they are completely different from each other. So we have also seen in the class, development from the skies, and in both of North Korea and the South Korea part, you see different lightning. So the outcomes basically different development. Similarly, if you take uh, different examples, that there could be different reasons. Okay, now let me take you to Pakistan. Okay, Punjab, um, Punjab's case, and you can talk about the case of Cape. Okay, so let's talk about the cities that are very near to each other. They might have same soil, they might have same climate, they might have same crops, but still the provincial growth rates are different. Why is it so? The government is also stay same, but the Punjab government is different from the KPK government. This could be one of the reason. Could be one of the reason. So again, in countries these differences are less, but when you compare India's Punjab and Pakistan's Punjab, which is a very classic story, you would find very interesting answers which would support that institutional differences across borders would certainly produce different productivity. The culture hypothesis, for example, because many of the economists again believe that culture is the reason why some are developed and why some are not developed. So, culture hypothesis, and I would also just say that why, let's understand that why culture hypothesis is dangerous is that the culture hypothesis say that, um, Protestants ethic has made the West part rich, and Islam discourages development. This is not what I am saying, is this is what some people believe. I might not agree to it, but I surely do not agree to it. But these are, some of the myths that are in the brain of some people, that it is the religion, which explains why some are rich and some are poor. Then there is also, that Asian cultures save a lot, they don't invest, and this is why they are less developed. These are all the culture hypotheses I'm trying to say. For example, African cultures lack trust. So in this book, the author rejects all these views. And he rejects because he says that culture changes very slowly and economic outcomes change very fast on the other hand. So same culture can have different institutions and which can have very different results. And in historical evidences as well, we have seen that for the case of Latin America, from where our lecture started, And Latin America was rich in the 1700s, and later it wasn't that rich, and Western offshores were going far ahead of Latin America. China was technologically advanced for centuries, and Islamic world led the science for hundreds of years. Okay, so this is very important that same culture can have different institutions and have different results. So Pakistan, for example, Pakistan is poor because people don't follow the rules. This is what we often hear. But do we ask, have we reflected upon that who are those people who are designing the rules? Pakistan has a bad economy in a very simple words if I want to say. Pakistan is not growing well. Pakistan has low GDP growth rates. Important is who is making the economic policy. Is there economist behind? We need to think on that. So who benefits when rules are broken? And when you answer these questions, you will find the answers of why Pakistan is not among the rich countries. Who escapes the punishments? Think and answer. So, culture is often used to blame victims instead of questioning the power structures over the world. So, this is important. And here we come on to another important thing, which is the ignorance hypothesis, which is most popular and most wrong, I would say. This hypothesis basically says that the leaders are poor because they do not know good economics in very simple words. And Acemoglu and Robinson rejects this very strongly. And they argue that bad policies are often chosen deliberately, not accidentally. So it's not that they do not know good economics, but they deliberately make such policies which are for their own benefits. For example, if you reflect back in history, colonial rulers knew that forced labor reduces the long term economic growth rate. Colonial rulers knew that monopolies would reduce the efficiency. Colonial rulers knew that education would empower the masses, yet they choose extraction. And why did they do so? Because it benefits the elite. So, in the case of Pakistan, tax exemptions are not ignorance. Loss making SOEs are not ignorance. Elite subsidies are not ignorance, I would say. According to this book, these are rational choices taken for powerful groups. So, institutions act as a central question. And this is, the key question that should remain in your mind till my next lecture of institutional economics at PhD level, this course. And the key question is the nations basically know that extractive institutions are bad and they would not unleash growth, but still, extractive institutions have occurred in the societies, in the countries, in the nations, in the world. So nation diverge because of institutional differences. This is important. And this is what we are trying to explain from a long time, that institutions are basically which would decide who has the power, who makes the law, who controls the resources, or who is going to benefit from growth. And once institutions become extractive in nature, they are going to create, obviously, inequalities, weak incentives, political instability, low innovations, less innovations. So this is why so this is why divergence has persisted over the century. I'm sure that you have studied this path dependency theory as well in macroeconomics. And there is actually a very strong link between path dependence and institutional theories as well, because once a country enters an extractive path, elites gain power and elites block reforms and institutions reinforce themselves. And this is the reason why poor countries remain poor and reforms fail repeatedly. Crises repeat. So when we say that poor are poor because they are poor, is because of this institutional lock-in. In the case of Pakistan, same families are in politics, same bureaucratic incentives, same power concentration, and this is institutional persistence and not coincidence. So we need to block this, countries need to block this if they want to grow. They need to actually change their institutional structure. So the key from this slide 7 is that poverty is not fate, poverty is not culture, poverty is not geography, rather poverty is institutional. This is the goal. Okay. Next, in this slide, we are trying to actually give you 4 types of institutions, and this is the theoretical backbone actually of the entire book. So if you understand this slide properly, we would actually understand the whole book. If you talk about the first example, which is, okay, let's first try to understand that what are, different types of these 4 institutions. Let's talk about the extractive economic institutions. The extractive economic institutions would have, insecure property rights. They would have monopolies. They would have entry to barriers. They would have informal sector dominance. Formal sector dominance would be less. Political connections would matter more than productivity. So there is going to be less merit. Merit would be less prevailing in these countries. And resultantly, the outcome would be low innovation, capital flight, brain drain, which is, the biggest dilemma of Pakistan right now, informality. So I would just, name these words and you would understand the stories. And I'm sure that I would not need to explain whole stories to understand extractive economic institutions in Pakistan. Okay, so let me say cartels in sugar, cartels in cement industry, cartels in wheat industry. Businesses would only succeed which have, very strong connections. SMEs would face, some blockages to grow. So there is a lot of stories that, there's a lot of names that I can help you to understand, the existence of extractive economic institutions in Pakistan. Okay, inclusive economic institutions would have, so first we have discussed the extractive economic institutions and now I'm moving on to inclusive economic institutions. So they might have, characteristics like they have secure property rights, just opposite to extractive institutions. They would be having secure property rights. They're going to have open competition. They're going to be educational access. They're going to be financial inclusion. And these institutions would encourage investment, promote innovation. They would promote innovations. They would support basically the long-term sustainable growth. On the other hand, if you talk about political institutions, which are even more important than economic institutions, and there is no divorce between political and economic institutions, by the way. They both exist together, and they should exist together, that there is no divorce between them. So, when you talk about political institutions are the one who would decide that who is going to make the law and who is going to enforce the law and who is the one who is going to control the coalition. So extractive political institutions would have features such as power concentration. There's going to be no accountability. There's going to be weak rule of law and order. There's going to be selective enforcement, and these institutions would protect the elite privileges. There's going to be monopolies. There's going to be rent-seeking behavior, and I'll explain it at the next class. What are rent-seeking environments, and what do we mean by rent-seeking in institutional economics? But for now on, you need to know that rent-seeking behavior is a part of extractive political institutions. So inclusive political institutions would have, features opposite to extractive political institutions. They would have broader participation, checks and balance, more independent judiciary system. There's going to be rule of law, and these institutions would basically limit the elite abuse. They are going to enable reforms, and they're going to explain or support the inclusive economic growth rate. When you talk about extractive political institutions, you talk about uh, the limit of absolutism, power in the hand of few. When you talk about inclusive political institution, it is opposite to absolutism. You talk about pluralism, which means giving power to many. So Pakistan has partial election, which is very inclusive element, but they have extractive economy. They have weak accountability, and Pakistan suffers from unequal law enforcement as well. So this Pakistan basically has a kind of hybrid system, which explains the instability. The core lesson from the slide 8 is that inclusive economics need inclusive politics, and inclusive politics need inclusive economics, and there's no divorce between both, and one cannot survive without the other. So this is really important for us to understand. The last is the important slide that we discussed in class is about the synergies. And in this synergies, basically we have four quadrants, and there's feedback loop. There is, the virtuous circle, and there is, different elements which is basically explaining it. Um, so basically, the most ideal position is this one where you have inclusive economic and inclusive political institutions. Um, so if you have inclusive economic institutions, this arrow is basically showing that. So basically, this is what we are looking for. And what we are trying to explain in this slide is that development is not technical, rather, development is political in nature. And if you talk about the case of Pakistan, in Pakistan, you see that IMF reforms without institutional reform, failure, privatization without competition, elite capture, elections without accountability, instability. This is all what we understand by this slide, and this is very important actually, because reforms are needed, and reforms would cause the creative destruction, um, loss of rents, loss of power, and this resistance is rational, not accidental in many historical examples. So this ends our basically today's lecture, and the recording is done. After that, we listen to the video of James Robinson TEDx talk, Why Nations Fail, and I have prepared a very nice essay on whatever is discussed in that video, and I will be sharing that on your GCR and LMS as well. So that's all. See you in next class. Allah Hafiz. Take care.